that time of the month again for another Doctor Who Big Finish main range release. Today I'm going to be taking a look at the November release for 2018, another 7th Doctor story, which is of course Warlocks, cross-written by Steve Lyons. Now this story is almost a series finale for the classic era, as it is in fact the final story from the unit trilogy that we've seen going on throughout 2018. Started off in the Heliax Rift with the 5th Doctor, then proceeded onto the 6th Doctor story Out of the Cybermen, and then all the loose ends get tied together in this story. So it is a rather exciting conclusion to a series that has been going on now for quite a few months. Of course, this episode is also another Doctor Who 7th Doctor story after previously reviewing 3 months worth of Doctor Who main range releases with the 7th Doctor Ace and Mel. This episode is in fact a standalone release, doesn't involve the previous stories in this line where we had a little bit of a plot arc going on with Mel. If you've seen the Quantum Possibility Engine review from last month, you'll of course know all about that already. This story is in fact completely standalone and interestingly sees the 7th Doctor a slightly older version of his character, which we'll be getting onto in a little bit. First off, and as always, in the description below, I'll leave the link to go and buy this release from the Big Finish website. It is currently out now. The physical CD is $14.99 and the download is $12.99. Naturally, if you are interested by what I say throughout this review, I do definitely recommend checking it out on the Big Finish website to listen to the trailer, have a look at the promotional art, and also take a look at the technical details on that as well. And no doubt there will be a few other links to additional reviews on the website also. So yeah, this is certainly one of those releases that I think if you're a Big Finish monthly range fan, this is certainly a little bit more for you, because it ties together a few loose ends and, as I say, is a plot arc that does essentially need context from the previous 2 stories in order for you to enjoy it fully. Firstly, taking a look at the technical details on the Big Finish website, as I was saying earlier, this episode is written by Steve Lyons, which I don't think I've actually reviewed any of his episodes in fact at all. I can't recall saying his name previously in the past in any other review that I've done at least. It's directed by Jamie Anderson, a Big Finish regular. The producer is of course Nicholas Briggs. The script editor is Alan Barnes, and the executive producers are Jason Hake Ellery and Nicholas Briggs. One of the interesting themes about this story and the actual plot arc that we've had going on between the 5th and 6th Doctor era is in fact that with these stories being written by 3 individual writers, and also the production teams behind them have also been a little bit different, the main person that has been responsible for bringing together all the plot arc threads and Barnes, and it must be said, I think that he has done a very good job. I think that Big Finish certainly do a very good job of achieving trilogies and storylines that the actual TV show wouldn't be able to achieve naturally within the classic series itself. I think that it would have been highly unlikely to kind of have a plot arc that has been intertwined between 3 different incarnations of the 80s Doctors. We did have a few plot arc threads here and there, such as say the Dalek War between the Imperials and the Renegade Daleks, but other than that, you could kind of enjoy the story without needing that context in there. I think that these stories are essentially a lot more tied together. They are certainly a lot more reliant on each other, and certainly this episode has a lot more aspects than the previous episodes. I could arguably say that you will be able to listen to, say, Hour of the Cybermen without listening to the Heliax Rift or this story. Same goes for the Heliax Rift as well. I think you could quite easily listen to that story and enjoy it without listening to the upcoming 2 episodes after that. However, I think that this story specifically is a nice episode. However, as I say, you won't get as much enjoyment out of this story if you haven't seen the previous 2 releases. And that said, if you haven't seen those previous reviews also, to kind of provide context for this review, I certainly recommend doing so before I get into the actual story itself. Taking a look at the characters for this episode, starting off with Sylvester McCoy as the 7th Doctor. I think that the previous review that I did that was kind of around this area would have been the 2 Masters, where we see a version of the 7th Doctor that is travelling by himself. He in fact have an older version of the 7th Doctor that is much more kind of drained and much less energetic to his previous self. It is certainly a massive comparison between that 7th Doctor that we originally saw in Time and the Rani and his first season within the TV show itself. This version is a lot more like a wiser old man that is kind of going throughout the universe. He's a little bit of a mad professor, always knows a little bit more than any other person in the room. I think that Sylvester McCoy does a very good job throughout this story of making the 7th Doctor not necessarily feel vulnerable, but very intriguing and very mysterious, and the simple fact that he is by himself means that all of the focus is on him. He doesn't really have any companions to kind of make the story more complex. The episode is solely focused around his character and his relationship with the people that he meets throughout that story. When listening to this story, I in fact unusually got a lot more respect for the Seventh Doctor, because I had a moment of realisation where I noticed that the Seventh Doctor has in fact gone through many different phases, almost like the Sixth Doctor to some extent, because he has so many companions and so many different eras. Same with the Seventh Doctor, we had that original hyperactive version, then we went on to the Doctor that met up with Ace and then decided to secretly train her for the Gallifreyan Academy, and then we move on to the sort of more developed relationship between Ace and Mel when she came back to the TARDIS, and we had that corruption storyline most recently in the Quantum Possibility engine, and then we have him facing off with the 11 that was seen very briefly in Doom Coalition 1. So we have many different versions of the Seventh Doctor, also not forgetting the Virgin New Adventures in there as well, and then also the box set that is coming incredibly soon, I do believe in fact this month, with another set of companions. And then finally we end off with this rather unusual version of the Seventh Doctor that is by himself in his big massive gothic cathedral TARDIS. And I think that this episode certainly represents a darker version of the Seventh Doctor, and it almost gives a little bit of an impression of what the Seventh Doctor era would have been like if Doctor Who was on in the 1990s, and I think that is a big appeal around this story and makes it a very enticing storyline. On to the companion for this story now, we have Tracy Childs as Klein, who is basically this person, from what I understand, has had involvement with the Doctor in the past. She was originally a Nazi or something to some extent, and then the Doctor did something with her, and then now she is a good character, or trying to be good, and something's happened with the timelines that has naturally meant that a version of her character that she once knew or thought that she would turn into is now dead and long gone, and she's living this life that kind of isn't her own. That is from what I understand. I've never in fact experienced any story with Klein in the past. I've not really noticed her character either, to be honest. I've not really heard many people mention her to me, but I think that Tracy Childs is a really good actress. I really enjoyed her throughout this story. I think that her relationship with the Seventh Doctor is certainly a little bit more on his level. I think unlike Ace and Mel, you did kind of feel like the Seventh Doctor always knew that he was better than them, kind of, and he always was the most intelligent person there. However, with Klein, she is UNIT's new scientific advisor. She naturally has a lot of respect from the Doctor because of her intelligence. There is a moment throughout this story where the Doctor even compliments her on her intelligence. However, naturally, something that you may have already understood from this review is because I don't have that context of Klein from previous adventures, I kind of felt like I was lacking something throughout this story. I was lacking that previous relationship. It did actually mean that throughout the first episode or two of this story, it did take me a little bit of time to in fact like her character and get to know her a bit more. I did certainly find Klein a very interesting and intriguing character, and certainly in the future I may go on to in fact listen to a few more of her stories. Maybe if you've listened to some of Klein's adventures, maybe recommend some. Briefly going on to the other characters as well, as I don't really have too many things to say about them. We have Blake Harrison, the guy from The Inbetweeners, playing Daniel Hopkins, of course the character that is tying together this plot thread that we've seen originally in the Heliax Rift. We've seen the old sort of medical version of him being rather new to UNIT. Then we have the outcome and repercussions of Hour of the Cybermen, really nicely exercised throughout this story. We see Daniel Hopkins, in fact, a much different version of him from what we've seen in the previous episodes. I think that almost the first story, Heliax, is him as an amateur, a part of UNIT, and then we have him being a little bit more sort of persuasive in Hour of the Cybermen and raising up the ranks a little bit more. And then in this story, we've seen how the backfire from the previous episodes has then led to him becoming the character that he is now. And the fact that he has met different versions of the classic series Doctors is also quite interesting, something which that we don't see too often in classic series Doctor Who. And yeah, I found him rather enjoyable throughout this story. If enjoyable is the right word, he's kind of mysterious. You don't trust him. He feels like the enemy, but he's also very intelligent and very cunning at the same time. And for that reason, you kind of like him, but he's also the opposite of the Doctor because he is naturally, because he's a part of UNIT, very armed forces in his approach. He likes guns, he likes weapons. He's essentially the opposite to the Doctor. Briefly, the other people as well, we have Genevieve Gaunt as Linda Maxwell, Richard Gibson as Colonel McKenna, Tom McGillan as Gregory Lord, and Russ Bain as Lieutenant Colonel Lewis Price, and then other parts are of course played by the other members of the cast. All of the characters throughout this story did do a very good job and certainly support the storyline quite a lot. I think specifically Genevieve Gaunt's character of Linda Maxwell, somebody that we previously seen, I think it was in the Heliax Rift from a few months ago. It was nice to see her character returning and once again offering a little bit more development to her and what has kind of changed in her life. But other than that, the cast is very good and certainly supports the episode. And now moving on to the narrative and storyline for this episode, because we've actually spent quite a lot of time talking about the characters, which does lead into one of the first issues for this episode. Because of the characters, because of the storyline, and because of the almost context that you need beforehand for listening to this episode, there is almost quite a lot of research that you need in order to go into this story, meaning that if I'm to recommend this story to a certain aspect of the audience and a certain ratio, I would certainly recommend this more to the people who've listened to the previous episodes of the Big Finish main range, and certainly the people that have listened to both the Heliax Rift and Hour of the Cybermen, or even maybe just Hour of the Cybermen. I think you could kind of get away with not listening to the Heliax Rift if you so wish, if you really have to choose, but I think that that is one of the flaws of this episode. It does rely a lot on the fact that you need that additional context from the previous stories. I think it does do a very good job of explaining, but at the same time, certainly in the early half of this story, a big bulk of the runtime is in fact spent establishing the stuff that has happened in the past and kind of establishing how that has moved forward. Of course, Blake Harrison's character, Daniel Hopkins, is now in the secure facility that was previously seen in the Heliax Rift. It has been converted almost into a unit camp to kind of now a medical bay where people are being treated, and we have the natural sort of unit scientific advisor role along with a brigadier style character who once again is very all guns blazing and very much different to the Doctor, and the Doctor comes in just in the nick of time in order to kind of watch almost the war of unit unfold, because this sort of trilogy is almost labelled as the downfall of unit series, which I do quite like that idea. I think that it is quite obvious that between the end of classic series Doctor Who and new series Doctor Who, there is a big development between what unit used to be, say throughout the third Doctor era, and then what it became in the later half of the 80s Doctor Who era. It certainly slipped away from the public's eye, and it kind of lost its authority a little bit, and it's to kind of have that provided context in these episodes as to why that maybe happened and how people lost respect for unit. And I think that it's clear throughout these episodes that there is a lot of corruption within unit itself. You have Klein, who is pretending to be a double agent when she's not in fact a double agent, and she's kind of supporting this charity group that want to welcome all of the aliens in open arms because they think that all of the knowledge should be in the public eye and things shouldn't be being hidden, and there's this conspiracy group, and there's kind of the backfire of why things are actually being covered up, and the fact that if normal humans knew what was going on, it would lead to a lot more people being in danger. And I think that this story, it would have been nice to maybe see them use that a bit more, because we got used to the sort of charity group at the start of this story and kind of the riots they wanted to do to go up against unit, but we never really heard of them again throughout the rest of the story. Instead, it is more focused around the idea of Warlock's Cross, which is basically a historical site in the Lake District where we later find out a spaceship has crashed, and that has led to kind of some mysterious apparitions that then kind of ties in with the Heliax Rift and Daniel Hopkins, and also Linda Maxwell as well, as I say from the previous story, Heliax Rift. And we kind of have the main context ideas and the themes coming in at that point. And I think that I was daunted, to be quite honest, when it came to kind of midway through episode 2 into episode 3, when you had a lot of that character building and a lot of the reminders of what happened in the previous stories. It did take a lot to kind of consider to start with, and I think that very easily you could get quite confused. So this is one of those episodes that may need either a very careful listen to it, so maybe even kind of dedicating a few multiple listens to this story in order to fully understand it. The actual spaceship that can kind of psychically infect people's minds and change what they are thinking and manipulate people, meaning that we do see kind of unit ripped apart throughout this story, and the Colonel in fact goes against everybody else, then Klein starts going against other people, and even the Doctor gets took over at some point as well, and he has this moment where he believes that he can go back in time and basically rewrite all of the events of the Heliax Rift and Hour of the Cybermen, and basically lead to a Doctor that doesn't really have the rules that the Time Lords have set out, which was really interesting. And I like the way that we had the Seventh Doctor almost suffering from that. You could tell that he's almost at the very end of his tether, which it was at that point that I kind of realised he is at the end of his era, and I almost feel like this might be one of his last adventures. I could very easily see him either going to Gallifrey after this story in order to resolve the problem with the 11, and then going on to Doctor Who the movie, and then obviously being shot down. And the episode is almost the end of an era, because you have the desolation of UNIT, them no longer being the powerful authority figures that they used to be in the Third Doctor era. Then you have the farewell to Klein as well, and that interesting relationship between her and the Doctor. Then you also have the ending sort of bookend for Blake Harrison's character of Daniel Hopkins in there as well, and kind of the closure of that storyline. And then you also have the Seventh Doctor coming to the end of his era, winding down, unwinding, ending story, and I really like that. I just like the idea of the Seventh Doctor being in 90s Doctor Who. Overall, that is really it for the Seventh Doctor main range story, Warlock's Cross, of course the final for the unit trilogy of 2018 from the Big Finish main range. Overall, I think that this is a fairly enjoyable story. As I said at the start of this review, you will get more out of this episode if you've listened to both the Heliax Rift and Hour of the Cybermen, meaning that I don't particularly recommend this to new listeners. I recommend this whole trilogy almost to new listeners. I think especially this might be one of the more powerful main range releases of this year. I think it's a great idea, and I think that seeing UNIT slowly kind of collapsing is also really cool, and also the Doctor has a lot to contribute throughout this story as well. And also Daniel Hopkins is a really intriguing character. As I said, seeing his character actually develop throughout the different eras of the classic series, seeing him go from the Fifth Doctor to the Sixth Doctor through to the ending of the Seventh Doctor era, it is a really nice plot thread, and I hope that maybe Big Finish might plan to do a bit more of that in the future. But that said, do be warned, if you're somebody that isn't really used to experimental Doctor Who stories, or at least episodes that provide a lot of context and require a lot of attention dedicated to them, but that said, at the same time, one of the major weaknesses of this story is, of course, that context. In the early half of the episode, you do have a lot of character building and a lot of context delivery in there as well. There is a lot of time in order to explain who the characters are and what happened in the previous stories. Perhaps maybe a little bit too much. I think that it would have been better to go into this story with the presumption that people know and fully understand the previous two stories. Maybe there's a bit too much explaining to some extent. So I do certainly recommend this for experienced Big Finish listeners, or maybe people who want to get into a whole trilogy at once that just so happens to go through 3 different eras of the classic incarnations of the Doctor. There is also a villain throughout this story as well. You may in fact be able to recognise them on the cover. They have almost big horns and they do look rather ape-like. Unfortunately, we don't really see too much of them throughout the story, which is another one of the negatives of this episode. I kind of feel like it would have been nice to go into those characters a bit more. Of course, they have the spaceship of the psychic energy, but other than that, you literally don't see any more of the actual monster. I don't even think that they get their own name, actually speak or anything like that. They kind of just growl like random odd ape creatures do in Doctor Who in the classic series especially. But yeah, they don't really have too much to do, and certainly they don't contribute too much to the actual story. So maybe if anything, it would be nice to see that plot thread developed a little bit more. What is this spaceship? What they're doing around Earth in the first place? And more so, what is the psychic energy? How does it work? Because I feel like almost that way it manipulated the Doctor must have been a very powerful force, and it would have been nice to see Big Finish maybe pad that out a bit more and explain the force and explain how the Doctor exactly was manipulated throughout this episode. Overall, that is really it for the 7th Doctor main range story, Warlocks Cross, of course the final for the unit trilogy of 2018 from the Big Finish main range. Overall, I think that this is a fairly enjoyable story. As I said at the start of this review, you will get more out of this episode if you've listened to both the Heliax Rift and Hour of the Cybermen, meaning that I don't particularly recommend this to new listeners. I recommend this whole trilogy almost to new listeners. I think especially this might be one of the more powerful main range releases of this year. I think it's a great idea, and I think that seeing Unit slowly kind of collapsing is also really cool, and also the Doctor has a lot to contribute throughout this story as well, and also Daniel Hopkins is a really intriguing character. As I said, seeing his character actually develop throughout the different eras of the classic series, seeing him go from the 5th Doctor to the 6th Doctor through to the ending of the 7th Doctor era, it is a really nice plot thread, and I hope that maybe Big Finish might plan to do a bit more of that in the future. As said, at the same time, one of the major weaknesses of this story is of course that context. In the early half of the episode you do have a lot of character building and a lot of context delivery in there as well. There is a lot of time in order to explain who the characters are and what happened in the previous stories, perhaps maybe a little bit too much. I think that it would have been better to go into this story with the presumption that people know and fully understand the previous 2 stories. Maybe there's a bit too much explaining to some extent. So I do certainly recommend this for experienced Big Finish listeners, or maybe people who want to get into a whole trilogy at once that just so happens to go through 3 different eras of the classic incarnations of the Doctor. Join me next month as I take a look at the second to last episode of the Doctor Who Big Finish main range of 2018, as I take a look at yet another Doctor Who 7th Doctor story, this time featuring Ace and Hex, as I take a look at Muse of Fire, also featuring Iris Wildthyme, played by Katie Manning, somebody of which who I, as of yet, haven't listened to when it's came to audio dramas, so I'm very excited to see what her character is exactly like, because I've heard a lot about her so far. So yeah, thank you for watching. I shall see you all next time. Bye for now.